My name is Grace, and I am so grateful to be here today. I thank the Scientists of Kenya Association, SCOKA, and Evelyn Kimanthi for this opportunity today. I also thank the University of Nairobi for hosting us in y'all's space this afternoon. I am really glad to be here. I would never have guessed that 4 years ago, when I started my YouTube channel, Tunyamutwe Moyo, that I would be at this opportunity to speak in one of the most premier medical training institutions in Kenya. My YouTube channel, Tunyamutwe Moyo, which translated into English is Small Living Organisms, is a platform where I talk about science topics in my mother tongue of Gikuyu. And I do this for two reasons. Number one, so I can be better at speaking Gikuyu. And number two, because I really believe that it's important to talk about science in the languages that people live in, aka our mother tongues. And so I think that that's a super important use of our time. And so that is, I think, why I'm here today to talk to y'all about using social media to talk about science in our mother tongues. My talk today will be divided into three sections. So the first section will be giving you some background into who I am and how I got here. Then the second section will be just kind of giving you a brief overview about science communication in general, what it is, why it's important, and some challenges that I think kind of exist in the African context specifically. And then I will close with a focused discussion of why I think we need to use social media platforms for science education in our mother tongues. So, some brief background about myself. So, my background is in the area of biology. I got my bachelor's degree in biology from McDaniel College in Westminster, Maryland. My senior project was focused on a specific protein that's made by a virus called the Mimi virus. And what the story of that work was that there's this one motif that is found in a protein that's made by the Mimi virus. And this motif has been found to have mRNA decapping activity in the host. So then my question was trying to understand, does this particular protein have mRNA decapping activity? And is the way that it makes its host sick by destabilizing this mRNA? So that was my question, and that was the project that I did, and that was my senior project. And so I graduated with a degree in biology. So I really, really enjoyed this project and this idea of biomedical research. And so I decided to get a job as a lab technician. So for those that may not be familiar with lab structure, typically, an academic lab is set up where you have a principal investigator who is the director of the lab, and then there's usually staff scientists, and these are people who may or may not have PhDs. What they do have in common is an extensive amount of expertise in whatever the lab studies and whatever techniques the lab studies. And these technicians can be super experienced all the way to really junior technicians, and that's what I was. And to be complete, other members of the lab typically can be graduate students who are people who are trying to get their PhD, and so they're usually using that environment to develop their thesis, and this can be PhD students or master's students. And then there's also usually undergraduate students who are trying to get research experience or to answer specific questions, maybe people who are interested in graduate school or medical school, and so they can get their experience in the lab context as well. So so I joined a lab as a technician, and the lab that I joined was a virology lab. And so the questions that they asked there is they were interested in the way that different viruses impact hosts. So once the summer was over, I found another technician job, and I worked there for about 2 years. And in that lab, we were interested in developing antifungal and antiviral drugs for specific fungal and viral targets. And so this was a biochemistry and crystallography lab, so structure-based drug design, basically. After that, the professor that ran that lab retired, and so then I found another technician job in a lab that studied this macromolecule called the proteasome. And so I really, really liked working there. And I think in total, I ended up working as a lab technician for about 5 years. And then at that point, I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school. And my doctoral project was in a microbiology lab. And my research question was related to understanding how the stress response of a specific bacterium relates to its ability to make us sick. So my target bacteria is called Shigella. So Shigella is a bacteria that infects our gut. And what happens is that it has to kind of go through all these different environments in order to make it to our gut. And so one attribute of many, many bacteria is they're able to look at their environment. Okay, not look with their eyes because they don't have eyes, but they're able to sense their environment and then they're able to adjust themselves based on the environment. And that's really, really key to their survival, and it's key to their infection in many cases. So I wanted to understand how their ability to adapt to stress is related to the way that they make us sick. And so this was my project. And so I found that indeed there was a relationship between their stress response and their virulence or their pathogenicity or the way that they make us sick. So anyway, so you might be wondering, okay, so you have this background in biology. How did you make your way to science communication and science translation? So the bridge between those kind of areas has to do with my grandparents and COVID. So during COVID, one thing that was really, really apparent to me was that there was a big gap between the way that scientists kind of understood science and the way that we were talking about vaccine development and the disease in general, and the way that non-scientists were talking about this disease. And I realized that this gap was even more apparent across different languages. So my grandparents, while they do speak English, they primarily speak our mother tongue of Gikuyu. So what I noticed is that the way that people were talking about COVID in Kikuyu language was very, very different from the way that people were talking about it in English. And so I remember wondering, okay, how are my grandparents interacting and engaging with this content? I remember wanting to call them up, and then I realized that I didn't know many words related to the science that I wanted to talk about. So I didn't really know how to talk about a virus because I wanted to describe it, but I didn't really know how to do that because there's no word for virus, right? I also didn't know the word for spike protein. I didn't know how to talk about the immune system. And I also remember calling my parents and asking for some help. And then I realized that actually many words that I needed simply didn't exist. And so I think at that point is when I truly got the awareness that there's a big gap in knowledge, especially in certain languages. And that is really what kind of propelled me to want to grow in my ability to speak Kikuyu better and specifically to talk about science. And so now in my second part of the talk, I want to talk about why science communication itself is important. So science communication is important because it helps listeners make informed decisions to motivate them to take appropriate and affirmative action, specifically about topics related to science that are impacting them. Another thing is that science communication encourages people to analyze their the integrity and legitimacy of all types of information that is accessible to them. Something else is that science encourages people to pursue STEM-related fields of study and employment, including women and members of minority groups. Another reason why science communication and science engagement is important, it helps us build a community of trust and understanding, specifically around the areas of biomedical research, which incorporates policymakers, scientists, and members of the public. So it kind of is this central hub where different types of knowledge can come together. Lastly, it's important to encourage governments and taxpayers to continue to increase investment into research funding. And so taken together, these are some of the reasons why it's important to invest in science communication initiatives. I know that there's a bunch of students in the audience today, and y'all might be wondering, okay, this is well and good. This seems very theoretical. What does this mean in terms of jobs? So what I want to do is point you to this schematic that was generated by a scientist called Dr. Gertrude Nontera. So she is a scientist by training, and also she does medical communications, and then also a lot of career development and career resourcing. And so she generated this graph or this image that you're seeing on your screen right now. And she kind of highlights different types of jobs within the area of science communication. And so what you see here are jobs like regulatory medical writer, public information officer, science communication and outreach coordinator, science policy analyst, science educator, technical writer, digital content manager, science writer, and corporate communications specialist. Okay, so all of this is well and good. You might want to know what are some of the challenges in this field specifically, and specifically on the African continent. So some of the challenges include the fact that science is perceived by some people to be a foreign concept and a foreign domain. I want to stress when I say this, I'm not saying that there is no science in African cultures. What I mean is the way that we interpret scientific knowledge and scientific information today is kind of created by a Western lens. And a lot of the medical technologies and medical developments and medical treatments tend to come from that perspective. And because they are usually from an external source, typically the idea of modern science is associated with foreign and Western ideas. On top of that, there is a historical role that science played in the imperialist agenda that has shaped the history of many African countries. Another thing is the fact that institutional support for research and research infrastructure in Kenya is not very high. And so scientists typically have to prioritize their attention to the scarce resources that they have to divide up. Another thing is that there is some government censorship of certain research topics in the public domain. And I think that this is a facet and a factor that sometimes can impact the types of topics that people discuss, especially on public fora. Another thing is that there is, I think now we're on item number 4 or challenge number 4, is that when it comes to building sustainable projects, it is very hard to do so because what ends up happening is that you have one person spend all this time building a project, but then because they don't necessarily have this like network of support, that project can fizzle out quickly and it's not going to get picked up again. Additionally, when it comes to funding, it is very hard to find funding for science communication projects. And it's also, and similarly, it's hard to find collaborators because everyone is so dispersed. And so to that end, I would like to kind of highlight the work of a nonprofit organization that I work with called Under the Microscope. And so what we've done and what the manager of Under the Microscope, Stephanie, has developed is she's developed this map that essentially organizes different science communication projects based on the country. And so what you do, it should be scrolling across your screen right now. So what you can do is you can click on whatever the country of interest is, and then you can kind of see the big science communication projects that people are working on. And so you can input this regardless of how big or small your project is. And what this does is that it makes it easy for people to find collaborators. It makes it easy to try and build grants together and find funding and kind of create this source of content and knowledge and information. And I think that's important. And so at this point, against this background and against this backdrop, why specifically should we do science communication in our mother tongues? So I came up with about 7 reasons. Point number 1 has to do with informal STEM education. So today we're talking about using social media for translation and for communication about science in mother tongues. And so if we think about what exactly is happening on social media right now in mother tongues, one thing that is apparent is there's a lot of storytelling, lots of stories about people's lives and about people's narratives. Let me give a specific example and specifically kind of paint for you where I think STEM education can kind of show up. If you follow Kikuyu social media in the last year, you might have had a story of a woman and her siblings, 9 of whom are intellectually disabled. Typically, when she tells her story, she highlights the fact that her upbringing was very hard. Her parents, both of whom have passed away, struggled very much with raising their big family, of whom, like I said, I think they had 12 siblings in total, 9 of whom are intellectually disabled. Today, this one sister who is not disabled is the primary caregiver, and so she is usually the one who is interviewed in these shows and in these episodes. And one thing that's always apparent is she is asking people not only for financial support so that she can take care of her family, but she also tells stories of how in her community, her family has been ostracized, her siblings have been made fun of, and she also talks about how when her mother and father were alive, how her parents got many questions about what they may have done wrong during their marriage, what curses might have been bestowed upon them. That tends to be the discussion that folks have whenever they hear this story. So what I propose is that on this same social media, where we are hearing these stories and we're kind of understanding this nuance, I propose that we make some space for modern knowledge about these topics. Specifically, so in a situation like this, I think it would be really important to have conversations that include the idea of inherited disease. Also a conversation that includes discussions of the fact that there are many developmental disabilities, some of which are inherited, right? Our languages don't really have words for these ideas like genes and proteins and such, but I think that we have the tools and resources to develop this type of conversation. We don't always have to have direct one-to-one translation. We can still communicate with ideas. So I think what I'm trying to explain is that social media is this really great way to connect us and to create space for stories. So that I'm saying that we can also create spaces for knowledge and learning, specifically about health. So in this setting, what I wonder is that if we had more spaces where we had knowledge specifically about scientific topics, is that one way where this woman's family can kind of get some awareness and knowledge about these siblings that are sick or that are disabled? Could more awareness about this issue mean less ostracization, less bullying, and more support? Because that is something that is common in every single interview that she talks about. She talks about how her family is treated as if they are barely human. And that is not acceptable. And so I think on this same social media, it is our responsibility to make some space for knowledge and knowledge resources. And I think we can do that in the same languages that these episodes are aired in, which is our mother tongues. So I'm just giving an example from Kikuyu social media, but I am certain that these problems and these situations are common across variable ethnic groups and ethnic communities. And so I urge you to consider the possibility of using the same social media as a knowledge platform and as a knowledge resource, in addition to collecting and fundraising, which is also important. Point number 2 has to do with creating fora for dialogues of hesitancy regarding medical and biomedical institutions. So historically, institutions of science and medicine have not been kind to people of color, to people of marginalized identities. And so I think that using social media to have conversations about our history and also to have conversations about medical questions and topics in languages that we understand and that we use, I think that will go some ways towards making people feel more comfortable about medical questions and health questions alike. Reason number 3 has to do with educating audiences and helping them develop agency. So this is kind of related to point number 1, because sometimes when you don't understand a concept or an idea, it is really, really hard to really trust the institution and the treatment that is coming from that institution. Creating an environment where people truly understand and can ask questions and can really dialogue about medical topics, I think will go really far towards helping people get agency, because then they can ask direct questions and they can feel like they are also part of their caregiving process. And I think, or caretaking process and caregiving, I guess, both ways. I think that it's really important to kind of create these fora. And I know it's very hard to kind of think about building this in our institutions, but I propose that one way we can start is by using social media platforms. Reason number 4 is that I think it's our culture. So science and understanding the world through science is a really key facet of all humans, including Africans, right? Oftentimes when we talk about African culture, we think about the past and we kind of look towards our past to understand where we are, which I think is only half of the puzzle. The other part of the puzzle is looking at where we are now and understanding how we exist and how we relate to the world and how our unique vantage point kind of shows up in the way that we live in the world today. And part of that means integrating some of the way that scientists understand and teach about the natural world. And so I think that whenever we talk about culture, we can't forget that today, the life that we're living right now. Several times I have thought that my ancestors, and I'm sure your ancestors as well, would be so interested in many of the developments and discoveries that have been made in modern science. I think it would be really cool to kind of connect the fact that in our past or in our cultural history, there were certain practices that were done, certain foods that were eaten, and it would be really interesting to track and kind of observe how that has been proven and supported by science. So for example, in many cultures, fermentation has been shown as a way to preserve food and also to preserve some nutrients. And so I think many of our ancestors would be fascinated to understand the role of fermented foods in the gut microbiome. Similarly, there are many foods that they ate that we know now have significant nutritional benefits. I think they would love to hear about the way that we understand nutrition today. So I think that science and science translation and these ideas of science are part of our culture. And so we have to remember that. And that is one reason why I think we have to translate science into our mother tongues. Reason number 5 is language revitalization. So in this particular day and time, artificial intelligence and machine learning and the use of technology is basically taking over the way we do things. And one thing that becomes apparent is specifically in the area of language translation. So today we have lots of tools for translating and for dialoguing across these electronic media, and many African languages are not really represented in those fora. And so one suggestion is that if we are able to create and continue translating words that can be used in our modern ways of understanding, then we can faster and more easily integrate our way onto those platforms. And in so doing, revitalize, and also preserve many ways of speaking and understanding the world, which is held in this container of language. And so I think that science translation proposes one approach towards language revitalization and language retention. And I think because languages typically hold our culture, it is very important, I think, to take care of them and to cultivate them and maintain them. And so I think that this is one interesting way to do that. Reason number 6 has to do with this idea of job creation. So creation of content on social media has taken over, I think, in Kenya. And I think many people understand that good content that people are interested in consuming and learning from is a great way of earning revenue and earning income. And so I propose that teaching science and talking about science on social media offers an opportunity for young doctors and young scientists to educate and teach, and it's an interesting way to make income, while also teaching audiences who may not have access to education. Point number 7. Point number 7 is this idea of interdisciplinary scholarship. So successful science translation enables fertile possibilities for interdisciplinary scholarship that includes the computer sciences to develop natural language processing and machine learning tools and resources, linguists to develop dictionaries and translation resources and words to help us develop words, sociology to help us integrate different ways of understanding and knowledge, life sciences, of course, since today we're talking about life sciences specifically, but of course this is applicable to physics and all of these areas of science, and public health for relevant and specific informational dispersal. So the thing is, interdisciplinary approaches to problem solving typically yield richer dimensions and better ways of creating knowledge that is relevant and culturally specific. Because one thing about creating knowledge, especially because today we are in an academic setting, oftentimes we deal with knowledge that's very hard for people to understand and to relate with. And today, especially, we are concerned about science communication. We're thinking a lot about lay audiences and ways that we can kind of bridge our knowledge development and knowledge understanding. And so I think it's very important to consider the role of interdisciplinary work, of which I think science translation generally falls into that kind of category. And so I hope that these 7 reasons have kind of given you some insight into why I think this topic is so incredibly important. And I really look forward to hearing your feedback about this talk and about this concept. As I close, I want to say a big thank you to the people that have made my work possible. And I would like to thank the crew at Oge Media, who I've been working with for the last few months. And this crew includes Kimaniwa Emma, Kathy K, Henry G, Paul M, Francis N, and Kate W. Also, I thank my parents for always answering the phone and helping me out with grammar whenever I needed help, because I'm not the most fluent in Kikuyu. I am also learning and developing my way of speaking it better. I also thank my advisor for being really supportive of this project from when I was in graduate school to now. I'm really grateful for her support. I also thank the Under the Microscope team for reminding me why science outreach is a really important part of being a scientist. And then the work of the last few months on the Tunyamutwe team has been funded by several private donors who value the role of education and who are very interested in science education in particular. So I want to say thank you to them for supporting us. And if you happen to be interested in supporting our team, please reach out to me. With that, I will take your questions.